Okay, so here we are. Right. So got here as a heading, going concern, and I've dotted down here, subheader. I've dotted that to be requirements. So there's certain requirements that have to basically certify this whole issue of a going concern. So the first one is I'm going to write P for purchaser, right? P for purchaser, or rather, let me not start with the purchaser, but let me rather start with the seller. So I'm going to write S for seller. I'm going to put a stroke here. The seller needs to be a VAT vendor. I'm going to put a VV for VAT vendor, right? Just for the sake of saving time, because we tend to say to. So seller needs to be a VAT vendor. That is the first part. And the second part is that, like the seller, the buyer as well needs to be a VAT vendor as well. Alright? So if we, for instance, we're in transacting, because you're the seller who obviously has the actual business and you're wanting to sell it. So you need to obviously sell to the next person who's likely going to be the buyer. So if you're selling to somebody who's not a VAT vendor, the implication is that you basically will not be able to sell that business as a going concern, which means you'll not be able to sell it at 0%, a taxable rate being 0 rated. That means you'll be faced with the implication of having to now suddenly charge 15 over 115 as your output VAT, based on that whole notion that we just spoke about, that would deem this arrangement not to be a going concern, but either ceasing to be a vendor because you've given up your status to be a VAT vendor, or you'd likely just be making a normal standard rated sale of just selling your business. So you don't want to be getting yourself into a situation where you're selling to somebody who's not a VAT vendor, because that is the most challenging aspect of a going concern transaction in practice, because you find people that are likely sellers and likely VAT vendors selling to people that are not VAT vendors, and in that instance, you just end up just getting yourself into what would have for nothing of relevance, So just make sure when getting into such, you get into such with somebody who's a VAT vendor. If they're not VAT vendors, make sure before you sell to them, they actually register to be VAT vendors. And you can just, get around that whole haggle of actually having to pay unnecessary output VAT, So that's basically the first part. The third part that we have to take into account is that there must be an agreement in writing. So I'm going to say agreement. And we'll just basically in writing. It was long. There must be an agreement in writing. That simply states that there must just be a tangible contract between the two people that are transacting with each other, that being your seller and your buyer, And the third part is that there must be an enterprise. There must be an enterprise which will equals to going concern. Let me actually just dot down all the points, then we'll discuss them holistically. Then lastly, we must have an enterprise as defined, right? And we must also have, sorry about that, supply of an enterprise, basically. We'll basically like talk about these all in of an enterprise, like that. Okay, so that's basically where we are. So, like we said, starters, if all these requirements are present, then we have ourselves a going concern. If one of these requirements is not met, it's either going to be a normal sale that would obviously attract VAT at the normal rate of 15/115 as opposed to just 0%, which is what we really want, because this is what we want ourselves as people transacting within that, especially for us the sellers. And we want there to be an agreement in writing. That basically means there must just be a contract in writing between the two parties, that being your seller and your buyer. And there must be an enterprise as defined. An enterprise, we went into that whole definition of what an enterprise is. So that whole definition needs to be met by the actual business in question. And there must be a supply of an enterprise. And that basically means that there must just be an enterprise which is a going concern at the time of transacting. It could not be a going concern if the actual business had been dormant for whatever reason. It would not be deemed to be a going concern. It must be an operational business that would have been actively operating when the actual seller sold to the actual buyer. In that sense, that would constitute it to be an actual sale of a going concern. Once all of these requirements have actually been met, then we've got ourselves a going concern, and in that instance, the actual seller can actually levy output VAT at 0% because it would be 0 rated. These are the benefits of having to sell your business as a going concern. However, we're still going to extend a bit on the technicalities that we also have to look out for as we are basically in this whole process of this going concern transaction going through. So as we are making this business available over to the actual buyer, so this would be now a relationship between the buyer and the seller, right? So for this to actually really solidify the actual definition of a going concern being really a going concern is that the activities of the actual business must actually also be looked at. Like the activities of the actual business or the actual enterprise in question must be also looked at. What are we saying? So the major activities being transferred, activities being transferred, or all the activities being transferred, must be ample enough for the actual buyer to be in a position to actually be able to continue the business like the following day. If you were to buy the business today, those activities must be ample enough for him to actually be able to continue with the business as of tomorrow, So it could likely not be a situation where an actual buyer receives a business that would have bought from an actual seller, but within that business, say tomorrow comes, the poor buyer is actually not able to continue with the actual business so as to open the business doors on that particular day, because for some reason or the other, there's just not enough equipment for him to actually open the doors of the actual business, because the business came in a building which doesn't have like ample like equipment for him to continue the business operations as they would have normally been with the previous seller, because for some reason or the other the seller just didn't supply him with some of the equipment that he used. In that instance, that would not deem it to be a going concern. So for it to be a going concern, there needs to be enough of the actual activities that will be your income earning activities. Your income earning activities must be transferred over to the actual buyer in their holistic or in majorly in their, or it must be the major income activities must be actually transferred over or in their holistic form, so as for the actual business to continue operating if the actual buyer wanted to operate tomorrow, for instance. So let's say you've sold a business that used to be a gym, for instance, to buyer B. And buyer B tomorrow wanted to open this gym, but tomorrow he did not have gym equipment available. All he had was an actual building that used to house the gym equipment. And all he only was able to get from having purchased the actual business was the actual building. In that instance, that poor guy did not get the actual income earning activities because he was not able to continue operations of the business in their former form as they would have been able to operate it, because there was no gym equipment available for him to actually continue with the actual business. So in that sense, there would not be a business it would not be deemed to be a going concern, right? And another issue that we need to consider is that the actual intentions of the parties must be in harmony with each other, basically. Intentions of the parties must be very harmonious in terms of the actual transaction being a going concern. Because if the intentions of the actual buyer is to change this business from what it used to be to something else, then that would not make it a going concern. So the actual business that you'd actually be buying from the actual buyer must, in its inherent form, basically be operating in a similar manner that it used to be operated by the former seller, So if it has changed in its complexity from what it used to be operating in, that would also deem it to not be a going concern. I hope we're getting this. And that basically sums it up without really spending too much time on the actual theory, because that just basically gives you the actual background as to what you should be looking out for. So intentions of the parties, very important. The income earning activities are very important as well. And it also doesn't mean that just because you are also buying a business which was not making a profit, it's not a business concern. So long as you'll be able to open that business tomorrow or as soon as possible, and so long as you also be continuing the business model in the same way that it used to be operated on by the former seller, irrespective of the profit margin of that actual business, even if it was making a loss, it would be deemed to be a business concern, and as going concern, and as such, it would be deemed to actually levy. The actual seller would be entitled to actually levy output VAT at 0%, and that would be quite a relief for the seller especially. So that's basically what we're basically trying to work towards so far as a business going concern is basically concerned, and it basically will be like, will be the main basis on which we're going to build on this actual topic as we're going forward, because the main backbone of the lesson is basically based on that. I've not written much down because I don't want to put too much on the whiteboard. I think I'm audible enough. A bit of dotting down also needs to be done by those that find these lessons useful and what I'm saying useful as well. So I've made those relevant pointers. So income earning activities must be a predominant feature that gets to be transferred to the actual buyer. Intentions of the parties must be in harmony with each other basically, so they cannot deviate from what the former seller used to actually do in terms of his business model, as opposed to what the actual buyer will suddenly be doing. So those two cannot be deviations from each other, which is why I use the terminology of harmony. There needs to be harmony between the two intentions, and the buyer would also not be expected to carry the burden of having to now worry about having to go get equipment for the business that is actually acquired, because for one reason or the other you would not be able to open the doors of that particular business because there was just not enough or ample equipment available for the business to actually continue operating, because the seller just decided to basically hold back on some of the equipment that he used to have in his actual business. That would not deem such to be a going concern. So such things just need to be looked at. And the one thing that I also spoke about in the last part there was profit is not of relevance so long as the business was an income earning business, and it was an income earning business not in the sense of making a profit, as long as it was operational and as long as it was deemed to be an enterprise, and of course we covered the 5 pointers, then it would have likely been a going concern, considering that it would have obviously certified all of the other requirements that we've basically dotted down. And I hope that gives you a bit of an idea of what we're basically going into. So with that theory now within our midst, we now well equipped to actually tackle a few dimensions of how this going concern transaction can basically come about, and we'll basically delve into those 3 unique differences that we'll have to likely tackle the question of going concern at this level. All right then.